titled it Forgiveness because forgiveness is kind of the punchline. Really, maybe what we should have talked about was how it's about resentment. It's about healing resentment, because this is really where we all start from. And so if you don't mind, stop screen sharing for just a minute, and I'm going to tell you my story of resentment, because I've got, like everyone, I've got my own barrel of resentment. I'm up in a super high conflict household, and both my parents were very, they weren't like, I mean, it wasn't that kind of situation, but they were very aggressive advocates for their own way, would be the best way to put it. And you know what happens when you grow up in that kind of environment, experience is, oh my God, I'm such a how could they be yelling at me? How could this be going on? But eventually you figure out that you're either going to be a victim or you're going to be on the other side of the experience. Some people, you know, might be abuser, might be just aggressive kind of person. At the nipple of my parents was that anger was a great way to overcome being a victim. And I think actually a lot of men have this experience where it's easier for them to be angry than to experience being vulnerable, you know, bad. And I think all of us, you know, men learn that anger and resentment are more empowering feelings than feeling like we're out of control. And so I grew up learning that anger was my sword and resentment was my shield. And I would go through life with my sword and my shield always up. And so the great thing about that is, as long as I had my anger and my resentment, I felt relatively safe because I was on the offensive. When you're on the offensive, people are less likely to come at you. But the bad news is that when you have your sword and your shield, nobody can get close to you. You know, like anyone who has resentment, I was lonely. I felt very alone, and I didn't know how to overcome that. And so what we're going to talk about today is how to make that transition from sort of festering resentment to, or always wearing a cloak of anger, to how to let go of that, because it takes a lot of, like, holding up that takes a lot of energy. It isn't just something that happens. It takes a lot of emotional energy and a lot of investment. So I'm going to screen share with you again. Last thing I'm going to say as I go to that is that resentment and anger, over time, they become a habit even, because you get comfortable with it. You want to be safe with it. And so what we're going to talk about today is when you get to the point where I did back then, where you're just tired of living in anger and sort of festering resentment, and you want to have a new, broader experience, we're going to talk about how to go from there to where we want to go, which is safety, freedom, love, new opportunity. Okay, so here's what we know today that I wish I had known then. Resentment is actually physically harmful. So when we stay in resentment and anger for high periods of time, we consistently have higher blood pressure. We sleep poorly. It's not that it says on the screen, loss of sleep. It's not so much loss of sleep as sleep is very intermittent. And so when you have intermittent sleep, your body doesn't really know, your rhythms are thrown off. Your body doesn't really know if it's physical impacts on your body. People develop stomach pain, neck pain, headaches. They can develop cramps and pains in other parts of their body and not understand why it is, because our mind is who we are in the world. Our mind resides not just in our brain. And so when we get jammed up with certain feelings, those feelings lodge in certain parts of our body.
I'm sorry, Rich, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm wondering if there are other people in your household, perhaps, who are streaming movies or video games, because your Wi-Fi is, you keep sort of freezing up.
All right, I've made sure that nobody streaming, what would you like me to do? Would you like me to reboot and come back, or how would you like to?
No, maybe when you have the slides open, as handsome as you are, let's hide your camera when you have the slides open. Maybe that will help a bit on the bandwidth.
I'm going to stop my video. Is that better?
Yeah, and then just keep talking. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you for the interruption. It's no good if I only hear myself.
Okay, thank you.
I heard myself plenty. All right, so please let me know if I freeze up again. Yeah, so resentment can cause your video to freeze up. Did you know that? No, that's not one of the symptoms. All right, so that constant release of adrenaline and cortisol that happens when you go back to something that you're angry about and just feed it and roll it and live in it, that manifests in your body. And eventually that cortisol and adrenaline buildup are actually toxic to your body. Now, me back then, when I was talking about back in the day, I just exercise nonstop, which is a solution to that. But ideally, you shouldn't have to do that. That buildup of adrenaline and cortisol leads to immune system breakdown, heart stress. There have been studies that connect cancer to high resentment. There's so much more. So here's my friend Nelson Mandela. And he says, resentment is like eating poison and hoping the other person dies. So I've heard Carrie Fisher attributed with this. It's true no matter who said it. And it's that idea that if I just sit here and I'm just angry at them just enough, they're going to get it. But they don't. Resentment, another expression I've heard is that resentment is like peeing in your own pants. It just makes you really uncomfortable and makes no one want to hang around you. And I can safely say that there was a time in my life where I used to walk into rooms and people would move away from me and I had showered and changed my clothes. It's just that I radiated resentment. Resentment is basically grounded in judgment. And the deal with judgment is we can't judge anything on the outside unless it's inside of us. So the idea here is you can't really recognize something on the outside unless it's within you in some way. So that doesn't mean that if you recognize that Adolf Hitler was a terrible, horrible human being, that you're just like Adolf Hitler. What it means is that to understand a man like that, you must have some of those elements in you. It means that as human beings, we all have the same capacity. We have the capacity for great evil, and we have the capacity for great good, if you want to use some extreme terms. So the good news is that if you have someone you really admire, you've got the capacity for that as well. And so when we judge people, we're judging people based on stuff that's within us, concepts, ideas, feelings, and emotions that are within us. So imagine if every resentment you hold is as much about you as the other person. Imagine that if there's somebody you're really angry at, there's some quality about them that triggers you because it's a quality about you that you really don't like. And I promise you, if you go talk about this with a therapist, they're probably going to go, yeah, let's talk about that. What is it about that person you really like? Another expression I've heard is every time that we point a finger at someone, we're pointing 3, or depending on how you hold your hand, 4 fingers back at ourselves. We are all human is the point. We all got good and bad qualities. And so it doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean if we're judging an axe murderer that we are an axe murderer, but it means that we might, under the right circumstances, with the same pressures and the same emotional drives, we might see the possibility of that in a way that we don't today. So the basic idea here is the world is our mirror. Everything that we judge and we see outside of ourselves, we're judging and seeing inside of ourselves. Or there's that, what is that expression? Don't judge because you'll be judging, you'll be judged. So the idea isn't that if you judge other people, you're going to be judged by someone outside of you. The idea is judge not lest you be judged, because it's happening on the inside. And judgment is kind of this double-edged sword. It's this great thing. Like when you're walking down the street, you want to judge whether how high the sidewalk is. And when you're looking at other people, if there's somebody who looks a little spooky, you want to judge make a judgment about that to manage your own risk. When I was a kid, I grew up in a really rough neighborhood, and I learned really quickly to have eyes in the back of my head and eyes all around at all times. And if I saw a group of guys that didn't look right, I made sure I was on the other side of the street, or I made sure I was walking a certain way so that I didn't give off that I was prey. So that judgment in those situations, that really helped me. But the danger of judgment is that we judge something and hold to that judgment. It's one thing to judge that might be dangerous, and it's another thing to say that's bad, that person's no good, they're always going to be that way. What we need to remember about judgment is like a snapshot, right? When we take a photograph of someone, it's two-dimensional and it captures them in that moment, but that's not all of who they are. So even the worst person in the planet has probably had some really good moments, and even the best person on the planet has certainly had some really bad moments. We need to look at each other on a continuum, and ourselves as well. Like, how do we forgive ourselves? Part of that has to do with, I may not have always been such a good person, but today I'm working at it. We need to be careful, because when judgment hardens into resentment of others or of ourselves, it can be really hard to break out of that. So whether you want to believe it or not, the answer is still forgiveness. And just sort of a thing that really is on my heart, and I'm going to avoid politics here, is if you just look at, for the last couple of years, how polarized the country has been, and people on either side think that they're right and the other side is wrong, whatever the context, whatever dispute you're looking at, they're sure they're right and the other person is wrong, but no one has the whole answer. The answer is somewhere in between. And the beauty of conflict is that everything creative comes out of when opposing sides meet, when they meet constructively, not destructively. When they meet with signs and guns and knives, that's not constructive. But when they meet with dialogue, that's constructive. But you can't get there without forgiveness. If you're living in resentment, then the first alternative happens. People meet with violence. To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you, said Lewis Smedes, who was a well-known speaker. So think about it. Resentments require constant nurturing. When you think about someone you're angry with, well, this is chapter 2. So let's just say that maybe you're in the middle of a divorce, and you've either started the divorce because they did something that really infuriated you, and in order to keep moving through that divorce, to some extent, you may be feeding that resentment, or you may be on the receiving end of the divorce and just feeling like, how could they do this to me? But still very resentful. In order to have that anger maintained, it requires constant nurturing and feeding. And every time you think about that person, first the betrayal comes up, and then comes up the anger. First the victim and then the anger. And then to stay with it, you have to feed it. And to some extent, when people are getting divorced, I remember so clearly when I got divorced, being so afraid for my children, but being so sure that it was important that we completed the process. And I think to some extent, I wanted to stay resentful, because that way it would carry me through, and my empathy for my children wouldn't stop me in the process, even though I was so sure it was right. So sometimes we'll use resentment, maybe not appropriately. Maybe the better thing to do would have been to think about what's really right for my children. And eventually I did really need to think that through. Eventually I needed to let go of that resentment, because the problem with resentment in divorce is that when parents are getting divorced, the most important people in the room are not the parents. The most important people in the room are the children. And so when we focus on the children, when we focus on that commonality and start to let go of our resentment and let go of our sense of hurt and our sense of pain, and start to forgive, that's when we can transform the relationship from a marriage into a co-parenting relationship, into a relationship where we can really focus on what we have in common, which is those children who are so important. So I want you to imagine for a second, what would your life be without having to feed those resentments? Like, how much more time would you have if you weren't thinking all the time about how bad he was or she was? How much more emotionally liberated would you be if you were releasing a sense of blame, resentment, and anger, and focusing on the well-being exclusively on the well-being of your family? Because I don't think there's anyone who has a resentment who doesn't still think about the well-being of their family. What if we could let go of resentment? And I love this image, because resentment really is a chain. It's a chain that binds us and holds us down and keeps us from moving forward into the light. And when we break that chain and let go, we are liberated. And forgiveness is the door. It's the way out. And what comes first is willingness. We need to be willing to forgive. And that's really difficult when you're hurt. That's really difficult when you've been feeling that pain for so long. It's really difficult when you're, in some cases, people are divorcing a toxic parent and they're afraid for the well-being of their children because they know that at the end of the divorce, that parent will still have the children. How do you stay willing under those circumstances? And again, it's about getting that those children need that parent in their life, even if they're toxic. And the best thing that we're going to be able to do for them is to equip the children to deal with people like that. But if we can't let go of the resentment, we can't equip them. If we're talking badly of the other parent to the child, we actually are poisoning the child and poisoning themselves, because they're walking around with a little mommy and a little daddy inside of them. And when daddy's saying bad things about mommy on the outside, it's happening between their ears also. So that's why it's so vital that we become willing to let go of the anger, become willing to let go of the resentment, become willing to get off blame and start to heal. Forgiveness is not a feeling that just happens. It doesn't just come over us. As I was preparing for this, I came across a Buddhist leader who actually had the complete opposite point of view. And I'm not going to name this Buddhist leader, but what that person said was that, forgiveness should happen organically. And I thought, I can't ever remember forgiveness just happening organically. I needed to decide that it was time. And every client that I've worked with needed to make a decision first, that they were done with the resentment, that they were going to focus on what was most important. Every client, every couple, every individual, every person who's come to me has all had that in common. They made a decision. They realized that time can't heal a wound that you have not cleaned, and you've got to clean out that wound. If you get a splinter and you don't pull the splinter out, the skin may heal over it, but it festers, and eventually you're going to have to take that splinter out. Resentment is the same way. Forgiveness is love in action, and it's not love of the other person, by the way. The other person might be an evil piece of whatever, just like you think they are. You don't have to love them, but if you love your children and if you love yourself, this is something you're going to do for yourself, because you do not want that splinter of resentment festering in your spirit. Forgiveness does not mean that we validate the other person, nor do we justify them. This is super important. When we forgive someone, we are not saying, you know what, you really are okay. And we're not saying, I really do want to have a friendship with you. You might not want to have a friendship with that person, but what we are saying to ourselves is, having this feeling is keeping me from moving forward, and I'm going to let it go. And the other thing is, as we talked about before, the resentment isn't really doing anything positive or negative for the other person. It's only damaging us. So forgiveness is all about accepting that they may be exactly how we've judged them to be, but it really doesn't matter, because we need to move forward. Forgiving does not mean that the other person is right. Some of us are really committed to being right. If we forgive them, it doesn't mean that they're right. It doesn't mean that anything they did to us was okay. If they verbally abused us, it was not okay. If they physically abused us, it was not okay. If they slept with other people, it was not okay. If they were abusive to the children, it was not okay. If they stole money from the family funds, it was not okay. None of those things were okay, but still we can forgive them. It doesn't mean that the behavior that they did is good or even valid, or it especially doesn't mean that we deserved any of that or that our children deserved it. It doesn't mean any of that. It's not about them. There's a myth that you can never care too much. I've read this again, when I was preparing these slides, I read this. It said, you can never care too much. And I was like, no, that is dead wrong, because staying angry is all about caring. If we didn't care, we wouldn't be angry. If it didn't mean anything to us, it would just slide right off us like water. When we really don't care, we totally ignore others. Right? When someone's insignificant, we don't even notice them. In fact, one of the most disrespectful things you can do to someone is to not acknowledge them. It's actually, in some ways, a higher level of respect to be hostile to someone. In a way, when we forgive, we're saying that they are no longer worth our thinking about them. Well, that's true and it's not true, because if the person's toxic in some way, we're going to think about what are the boundaries we need to set to maintain safety in our own lives while we guide our children through this relationship. But it is saying that they're no longer worth our thinking about them day and night and all the things they did to us and how painful it was. That is no longer worthwhile. Forgiveness is where we can emotionally unhook ourselves from the other person. And that way, when we unhook ourselves from that person, we're free to move on to a new relationship with them, not necessarily a loving relationship. It might be a business relationship with them. How are we going to raise these children in a way so that they're successful in life? It doesn't have to be emotional. It might be a friendly relationship, but it's certainly going to open the door for relationships with other people. Because when we're spending so much time obsessing about one person, thinking about them all the time, feeding that feeling again and again and again, there isn't a lot of room for other people. So how has resentment limited your life? I want you to think about that for a second. Just think about how much time really have you spent feeding resentments either towards your soon-to-be ex or other people in your life. I know that some of the people I've worked with have made massive resentment lists when we work together. I've had them sit down and write down what are the circumstances and what did the other people do that led to resentment. And they've given me pages of people that they resented. They've given me pages of institutions, countries, religious groups. They've given me races. They've given me everything you can think of as part of their healing process. I mean, pages of this. And imagine how much energy they spend maintaining those pages of resentments. How much more time and energy will you have when you let them go? I can tell you those clients who worked with me, when they let this energy go and they let the resentments go, it was like a huge weight came off their shoulders. It was unbelievable. What could you do for yourself, for people you truly care for, with all that time and emotional energy? If you were no longer mad at anyone, if you walk down the street, never having a resentment, I'm not saying not being careful, but never having a resentment, how freeing would that be? What new possibilities would you have room for in your life? What new possibilities would your children have having you in that space? How much more can you be there for them? How much more could you advance their lives? So I'm going to introduce you to I guess it's a system for forgiveness. It's the REACH system for forgiveness. And my friend, I call him my friend, even though we've only met virtually, Dr. Everett Worthington created this system. He's a professor of psychology, and he has tested and validated this system. And he's found that like 80 or 90% of the people who use this system have a higher sense of well-being and happiness when they're on the other side of it. And this is not a silver bullet or magic wand. What it is a way to start to move ourselves from resentment and anger to a place where we can release that resentment and anger. And as I said, the first thing that's required is what? You have to be willing. And if you're willing, what's next? You need to make a decision. So REACH is an acronym. Recall the hurt, empathize, give the altruistic give of forgiveness, commit to forgiveness, and hold on to the forgiveness experience. And we're going to talk briefly about each of these, and we're going to open this up for questions. So recall the hurt. So recall the hurt means actually almost the opposite of what I've been saying. I've been saying you want to release the hurt. You don't want to keep feeding it. But really what I've been saying is you don't want to feed the resentment. What you want to get to is the sense of hurt that's underneath the resentment. What was the original hurt that inspired the resentment? And remember that anytime that we feel like a victim, it's because on some level, a dream that we had has been crushed. And so just remember that that hurt is about some dream being crushed. We know that in the divorce process, for example, people are releasing all the hopes and dreams that they created with the other person. That's an incredibly painful process. Marriage is on any level is a big commitment, and people get together because they have shared vision, shared values, shared dreams. So there's a lot of crushed dreams when it comes to the divorce process. So recall it, make it live, every detail, allow yourself to be the victim and have the feelings. And I'm going to add something here that Everett doesn't really speak to. We avoid this, number one, because America doesn't favor victim mindset much. You know, we're America, we're always going to be strong, we're always on top. But we also avoid it because it's seriously painful. And so the way to limit this experience is to make a distinction in your mind between grieving and mourning. So grieving is that sense of loss, that sense of pain, and grieving can go on for your whole life if you wanted to. Mourning is the decision that you're going to allow yourself to grieve very intensely for a limited period of time. So if you're going to recall the hurt, decide that I'm going to relive this for an hour. I'm going to relive this for a day, a week, whatever it is, so that I can really experience it and not have it interfere with the rest of my life. And then at the end of that, 10 minutes, half hour, hour, 5 hours, whatever period of time, day, whatever you have going for you, you're going to say, all right, I'm done with this now. I'm done with being the victim and feeling sad and mourning and grieving. And that doesn't mean you won't have that feeling come up again, but it will not come up with the same intensity in the future. When somebody dies and we mourn their loss and we have a ritual for putting that person, their memory, as a person in our lives, moving on to somebody who's somewhere else in our lives, maybe not physically in our lives. There's a ritual that we go through for that, and that's mourning. And it's a limited time offer. And pretty much once we've buried the person and had whatever ceremonies we're going to have at that point, we may still feel sad and we may grieve, but we're not going to have the same intensity of it. And so that's what we're talking about here. Next is empathize. So now we're going to think about the person who did the deed, the person who crushed our dreams, the person who broke our heart, who hurt us. We're going to do the thing that we haven't been doing in resentment, and that is we're going to empathize with them. So we're going to replace the resentment or start to displace the resentment with positive emotion. Now, again, empathy does not mean that we like them. It doesn't mean that we love them. It doesn't necessarily mean that we care for them, but it means understanding where they come from. I have one client who I'm working with right now who has a very narcissistic now co-parent. She's almost done with her divorce. And she has spent a lot of time thinking about how did her co-parent become the way he is? What kind of childhood did he have? Who are the influences in his life that he became this very defended, sad, angry narcissist who thinks only of himself? And so in that process, she's come to understand why he is the raging megalomaniac that he's been with her. And she has been better able to forgive him, not like him, not love him, but forgive him, understanding that he is the product of a really damaged childhood. So that's what we mean by empathize. We want to understand, how did they get this way? It's not just that they're jerks. Someone twisted this person. Something happened to these people that they became this way. You know, most people don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to be a raging jerk today. Mostly they have circumstances that drive them to it, and they do it to defend themselves. You remember my sword of anger and my shield of resentment? People defend themselves in all different kinds of ways. Next step is altruism. Now you want to think about, when were you forgiven and what did it feel like to you? What's a time in your life where maybe you didn't earn it or deserve it, but somebody chose to forgive you? And how good did that feel? And now, because you understand where that person comes from, we're going to give the person that the person who crushed our dreams, we're going to give them the gift of forgiveness. And it doesn't mean you have to tell them that you forgive them. It doesn't mean you have to write them a letter. It just means in our heart, we're going to give them the gift of forgiveness. And in this case, it's not a self-interested gift. We're not giving them a gift so we can get something from them. It's a gift that we're going to give them in our own mind to bless them, but it also blesses ourselves, blessing in the generic sense. We're blessed with the thought that, okay, I'm done with this. I can move on. What greater blessing can you imagine? Next, we're going to commit. We're going to commit to the forgiveness experience. So what that means is we've gone through the first 3 steps, and now we're going to get that, you know what, we're probably still going to have some feelings of hurt. we're probably even going to have maybe a little resentment come up. But when that resentment comes up, we're going to stick with the altruistic gift of forgiveness, because we understand that they are the way they are because of how they grew up. We understand that they probably weren't even doing this to us personally. They probably don't even really know who we were, because if they did, this wouldn't be happening this way. We're going to commit to that act of forgiveness no matter what comes up. And last of all, we're going to hold to that. We're going to hold on to it. We're going to hold on to that forgiveness experience, that feeling when we understood who they were, we understood where they were coming from, and how good it felt to give that forgiveness. They're going to do and say things that are going to trigger that hurt again, because that's just who they are. Until our wound is healed, we're going to be vulnerable to it. We're going to be triggered, but we're going to hold on to that forgiveness. And what that might mean is, if we're in the presence of this other person, and if you're getting divorced and you have children, the chances are you're going to be. If we're in the presence of this person and they trigger us for some reason, we're going to hold on to that sense of forgiveness. And maybe we're going to take a time out instead of going to anger or resentment like we normally would, like we'd normally push them away and defend ourselves with that. Instead, a boundary we might have made for ourselves to hold on to the forgiveness experiences, we're going to go to the bathroom and take a time out. Or we're going to tell them, I really can't talk right now. I'm going to get back to you in 15 minutes. 15 years, whatever amount of time you need to hold on to that forgiveness and get back into a place of empathy. That's the reach process. And it's not something that works overnight. It's something that works over time. If you want more information, just Google Everett Worthington forgiveness. He comes right up. But you'll find not much different than here. And what I can promise you is what'll happen is forgiveness will come on in stages, and some hurts you'll release pretty quickly, and some are going to take time and work. Some forgiveness holding on may be followed up by working on your own triggers. You may find, wow, I've got some things that really trigger me, and this person just happens to be really good at it, but other people have been triggering me too. I need to get some help with that. You're going to open up a door to a whole new life, to a life where you can be more vulnerable with the people that you trust and feel safe with, and be more careful about not being accessed by people that you don't feel safe with, by people who trigger you. And that all comes with this work. It's the beginning of a journey. It's not the ending. When you finish the reach process, you're not done. You're actually just beginning. And with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing. Well, actually, I'll probably go back to the first slide. And if you have any questions, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, Rich, you can stop screen sharing and then just have your video on. That would be great. Thank you so much. That was very, very good. I don't know if we trust my video.
Let's see if we trust my video. Here I am.
Wonderful, Rich. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, let's open it up to any questions from our audience out there. You can type in the chat or the Q&A. I guess the Q&A is for questions, so you can type in either the chat or the Q&A and we'll take a look. There's one, and I guess this question's from me. So, I totally agree with everything you said, and sometimes it's easier said than done, right? And so when you're in the moment of the resentment or, an issue or incident, it's really hard to kind of like consciously stop yourself, right? From this heated feeling that you have, and to like redirect, sorry, my dog's in the background, and to redirect your focus on forgiving and empathy. And so how does one do that?
Yeah, so having the dog barking is kind of a perfect example. Just like your dog, we've all got this part of our brain that's all about defending us. And once it's triggered, it's very hard to get out of that part. Like that part of our brain, it's looking for danger. It's either fighting or we're running, one of the two. And so this is it's as much about trigger management as releasing resentment. When we're triggered, the best thing we can do for everybody, unless we really need to fight, is just take a time out. So the second that we say to ourselves, oh, wow, the second that we notice that we're having an emotion that's not going to be constructive for the experience that we want to have with the person, no matter what they've said and done, we either take a second and breathe and get back in our body and reset, or if we're really emotional, it was like I was saying at the end there, we might want to say, I'm sorry, Mal, I'm really upset right now. I'll see you, I'll call you back in like an hour. Or might not even say upset. I might just say, you know what? I just remembered, I forgot something. I got to go take care of it. I mean, you really don't have to make an excuse even. You can just say, you know what? I need to take a second. And then you go and reset, think about, all right, what triggered me? How real was that? Part of noticing the trigger is once you identify that part of yourself that's reactive, the next time it comes up, you're going to identify it faster. And every time you focus on that and see what that is, the less power it's going to have over you. And the other part is that, the second that you identify it, you're moving to a more analytical part of your brain, the part of your brain that's not about fight or flight. And so that's going to give you a little more intellectual control. You're muted. You're beautiful.
Sorry. And that's great. And I loved how you were talking about empathy and, realizing that your ex obviously is the way he or she is because of something else that happened to them, and to kind of, have that realization and show empathy towards them, and not take it personally and be the victim. We have another question. Looks like, okay, he is everything I would never want my child exposed to. He's narcissistic, a liar, and a cheater. How can I let him near my child, much less forgive him?
Yeah, well, this comes up a lot. I work with a lot of people who have this situation going on. I'm thinking a long answer, short answer. So the first thing is, no matter how awful the other parent is, our children base their sense of self on who they have in their lives. And if the other parent wants to be in their life, it's probably better for the child to have that person in their life. So the people that I've working with and have worked with who have someone that they believe is really toxic on the other side, what they do is they teach their children lessons about how to deal with whatever they think the toxicity is. So if that person is, let's go, pathological liar, that person's a pathological liar, they will give their child lessons on how to deal with someone who just lies all the time. And the lesson is not, you're a liar, because pathological liars just completely deflect that. The lesson has more to do with, all right, how do you maintain your sense of self and not get sucked into their reality, which is not yours. And so they give them lessons about how to deal with people like that. And they don't say, this is all about him, but your dad, I'm equipping. What they say is, this is how you deal with people like this. And eventually when the child reaches a certain age where they start to recognize what they've been equipped for in the other parent, then they start to put into place the things that they've learned. And actually, I've had children go back to their parents as when they're adolescents and say, were you talking about dad when you taught me those things? And they're just like, mostly they won't say.
Right.
Because any kind of destructive remark or emotion or feeling about the other parent is not helpful for the child.
Right.
But they might say, well, could be.
Yeah.
You got to judge, but that's the only, when you have that toxic parent on the other end, you got to equip the child to deal with that particular brand of, like you would equip them to deal with any other predator. Right.
Totally agree. That's good. Okay. And then let's see, we've got another question. How is forgiving them forgiving me?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. What I didn't really talk about here is the implication of forgiveness and going through that process is what we're saying is, I'm not willing to feel like a victim anymore. And so what I didn't really talk about, that maybe I should have, because we had a little extra time, maybe next time I do this, I will, is there's a difference between being in a relationship with someone who's like physically abusing you, and then the feeling of victimization that might come when you're not with them. So if someone's physically abusing you and you have no escape, you are clearly a victim. If you're being, sexually abused, you're clearly being victimized. There's just there's no negating that. But there's a difference between, there's a mindset, there's the experience of being a victim, and then there's the mindset of being a victim. And part of forgiveness is shedding the mindset of being a victim. What we don't want is to walk through our lives feeling like everyone's abusing us and everyone's taking advantage of us. And when we're wearing that mindset of being a victim, when we're wearing that, at some point, there's also like guilt and shame, like somehow I must have chosen this, that comes with it. When you're in those kind of situations, there's like, oh, I must have done something really wrong. I grew up in a very angry household. There was a period of my life, I must have done something really wrong to grow up with these angry people. It's like, no, I was just born, right? Like, but just like my clients, I needed to get past that sense of maybe I deserved it. So that all, it's totally irrational. It makes no sense whatsoever. But it's like forgiving, you forgive yourself for having been in that position. And and by doing that, you empower yourself to not be open to those kinds of influences in the future. Because I guarantee you, if someone's been sexually abused, they recognize a sexual predator before anyone else. And I guarantee you, if someone's been physically abused, they see the threats of violence. They're super sensitive to that. So the forgiveness process empowers you to stop, not only to forgive yourself for being a victim, but to not be a victim in that way, at least in the future.
Right.
It's this very strange dynamic. It's like children, when their parents get divorced, children always feel like they are responsible.
Yes.
And I'd say this to people and they go, no, it's not true. And then 10 years later, the kids say, Mom, I felt like somehow I did something wrong. And that's why you and Dad got divorced. Like, it's totally irrational. Somehow as human beings, we take this stuff onto ourselves. So part of the process is not just forgiving the abuser and in doing that, somehow we forgive ourselves.
Yeah.
And also, who doesn't want to kill their abuser? Right? I mean, if you're being abused, some part of you wants to destroy that person just to make it stop. And then you feel guilty because you recognize there's an identification with those feelings with the abuser. So then you're becoming the abuser within yourself. It's so that's why that forgiveness, it's not whatever's outside is inside, whatever's inside is outside.
Yeah. The basic two wrongs don't make a right.
Yeah. Not that you would go out and physically abuse people or sexually abuse people if you were sexually abused or physically abused, but there is a sense somehow that you get it. I won't go on about it.
Thank you. We could do a whole nother workshop on that.
That is a very serious workshop.
Well, thank you to our viewers out there. And thank you, Rich, so much for this useful information on forgiveness. I hope that our audience out there has found some useful tips. I know I have. And you can find out more information on our website at chapter2club.com, and Rich in Relationship as well. And we will see you guys next time.
Yeah, and I apologize for my internet. I'm in a sketchy internet neighborhood.
Oh, no worries. No worries.
Thank you.
All those other people are using my bandwidth out there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.